When I was about 8, we moved into this rundown house, which I later found out that the entire area used to be a First Nation camp, but there was a huge landslide some 100 years ago, and so the entire area is pretty much houses and a baseball stadium built over an ancient burial ground, and doors would slam and my dad was thrown from the wall point to point. The basement was terrifying and had a chain lock on it, and while my mother was in the bath, I decided to close the door since it creeped me out, but when I shut it, it slammed back open and hit me in the face violently. Those are just some of the examples from what happened in that house. And when we moved out, my dad and sister took down drywall in the basement and found satanic symbols all over the walls and an odd odor which had a passageway to hell written on it. So, turned out the previous tenants were Satan worshippers and the landlord knew, so we got the hell out of there. I know it sounds insane. It's insane to me too, but I think something attached itself to our family from that house. When I was 11, I was looking for my shoes when I opened a cupboard in the basement, and I felt someone breathe on my neck, and a male voice whisper, "Thank you," in my ear. That same year, my dad and I were in the kitchen at around 1 a.m, and he all of a sudden looked terrified as he's staring at nothing. I've never seen my dad so scared, and the room went cold. I'm not a religious person, but I started praying, that prayer that goes, "Our Father." My dad was turned away from me, and I was mouthing the words so he didn't know what I was saying. But he turned around after a few minutes and said, "I don't know what you said, but you saved us." And he refused to tell me what was there, and to this day refused to talk about what happened. He was crying and shaking, and it's the only time I've ever seen him like that. When he got his new apartment after him and my mother split up, I went to stay with him for a few days, and during that time we would hear weird noises and things would go missing everywhere. We were sitting in his kitchen facing the stove since we heard a noise, and right in front of our eyes we watched as the salt shakers went flying off the stove. For some reason, nothing paranormal ever happens around my mother, just around myself and my father and older sister. I'm 17 and my sister is 26, and like my mum, my 9-year-old brother has not had a thing happen to him either. On a side note, though my sister saw a psychic who told her that her dead boyfriend was attached to her, along with something else that felt evil, which is why we came to the conclusion that something had followed us from that house. When I was 13, my mother and brother and I moved in with my mum's old friend. Things kept happening, but now that my dad and sister weren't with me, it only happened to me. I was standing in the kitchen home alone when a fork flew across the kitchen and hit the wall. But when I went to see where it fell, there was nothing there. Another time I was laying in bed with what seemed to be sleep paralysis, but something grabbed my ankles and physically started dragging me off my bed. By the time I could move, I was almost completely falling off the bottom of the bed, and I in no way could have moved myself down there as I had zero control over my limbs. When I was 15, we moved into my current house, my mother, brother and I, and things were quiet for a while. Every time we move, it seems like things would calm down before resuming. Honestly, my theory is that every time we move, these entities have to find us again. The first time that something happened in this house, I was standing in the living room and a picture flew across the room and shattered. When my mum and brother are out, someone will play the piano at 3 a.m. And I know for a fact it isn't my cats, since it's usually two-handed melodies that last anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Here's the part that confirmed my theory, at least to me, that something had followed us. I was laying in bed not trying to sleep, but I had the lights off and my eyes closed from a headache, when I felt someone breathing on me and heard a voice whisper, "It's mine." but it was the same voice that spoke to me before I was 11. I would recognize it anywhere. I freaked out and placed cups of salt in various places in my room, along with different crystals given to me by my mother, an Aboriginal friend. Now, look, this next part I'm not proud of. I knew I was insanely stupid, but on my part I'm a kid, and kids do dumb things. A while after I heard the voice, I went to a bonfire and was drinking, though only coolers, as at a max, it was around 3, and I was not drunk. So I went to my friend's house to sleep. She is First Nation and communicates with spirits through a Ouija board. Her and my other friends wanted us to use one of them, and I stupidly agreed. It answered us, and I can't remember what exactly was said, but I do remember her asking, "Do you like Allison?" So me, and the board said no, and then yes when asked again. But around this time my chest became very constricted and I found it hard to breathe. I was hyperventilating and crying, and felt like I couldn't get any air into my lungs. They told me I was freezing cold, and my pupils weren't responsive. They ended up calling the ambulance, who ruled it as a panic attack. But the thing is, while I do experience panic attacks and pretty bad anxiety, my panic attacks are widely different than that, and I was completely calm and not anxious whatsoever. So that leads us to what happened a few days ago, and I'm pretty worried that the Ouija board may cause this to get worse. So ever since I put salt in my room, nothing paranormal has happened in my bedroom, and so I began to feel safe in here, which I guess I shouldn't have let myself fall into that false security. I was sitting on my bed, my headboard against my window, and I have my blinds closed and a blanket over my headboard so that no one could look into my room, when I heard something tap against the window. I heard it for a few minutes, so I turned around and saw out the window. At first I saw nothing, but then there was something pressed up against the glass in the shape of a head. My light was on, so I couldn't make out any features, but it seemed as though they were wearing a hood, and that it was hiding its face from me. I thought it was someone trying to break in, so I started screaming, and we called 911. The police came and brought us outside to show us that there were no footprints in the snow whatsoever. Not to mention my window is too high for someone to be face level with without a ladder or chair. So what else could it be other than paranormal? I know what I saw. I stared this thing down for at least 10 to 15 seconds as I was frozen with fear. My mum called her First Nation friend who was going to come and smudge our house in a few days for us. But other than that, I don't know what else to do. I'm terrified, looking over my shoulder constantly and having to look out my window to make sure nothing else happens out there. If anyone has any advice or idea of what is happening, please help. I know this sounds crazy, but it's the truth. In 1996, when my mum was 6 months pregnant with me, she decided that she wanted to play the Ouija board with her sister. My grandmother died about 3 months beforehand, and they wanted to see if they could contact her. My mum and aunt say that they had talked to what they thought was their mother, who tragically died in that house 3 months prior. They spoke for about 30 minutes until the planchette made a sharp movement, and the air went ice cold. The planchette was moving very fast on the board as it kept repeating, "Mine, mine, mine." This really scared my mum, so they stopped the session. A few weeks later, my mum goes into labor. At the time, this scared my mum because I was a month and a few weeks early. When I was born, I was so small that I had to stay in the hospital for 2 more weeks. All was well when my mum and I left. Fast forward to when I was 4, I started getting horrible night terrors of me sitting on the top of the stairs in my house. In the dream, you could tell that it was daytime, but it was still dark. My feet were stuck to the floor like it was quicksand, and I would scream and scream for what felt like hours, and at the end of the dream I would always be able to see something crawling up me slowly. It was very skinny, long-limbed, this black creature with extremely long fingers and darker fingernails that were even longer. His eyes were a big, burning red. I would get this dream so often that when this creature would start to appear, I would be able to wake myself up. These dreams were quite an often occurrence, almost every night. I told my mum about it, and she told me that I shouldn't stay up late and scare myself with stories. My mum's attitude definitely started to change when my little sister started saying creepy things. At this time, my sister was 2.5 years old and very smart. One night, my sister and I were in my room getting tucked in at the end of the night, and every night my sister and mum played a little game before bed. My mum would tell my sister to spell a word, and my sister would spell it, and she would get a prize. As my mum said goodnight to us, my sister says, "Mummy, can you spell black man? Better run." She said this in the most sing-song horror movie kind of way. That night I woke up to something very odd, an old lady at the end of my bed. Honestly, she looked so real, I thought a real old lady was in my room. I screamed, turned on the light, and she wasn't there. Totally creeped out. I remember keeping the light on, as I couldn't sleep in the dark anymore. It was too paralyzing. All of a sudden I wake up in the darkness again. I didn't even remember closing my eyes to sleep, and there was that old woman at the edge of the bed. This time I knew she wasn't human. She had blue skin, rotting teeth. Her eyes were an unnatural blue, and she was just staring at me, smiling. Then she began to laugh. It started with a small giggle, and then she started cackling. She laughed so hard that she threw her head back, acting like a mental patient. I was in such shock I couldn't even cry. My mouth was agape, and after a while she was laughing so much her mouth was getting larger. It unhinged like that of a snake, and then suddenly mid-laugh she stops, snaps her head back, and in a very fast and low man's voice says, "If you're scared, cover your head, little piggy, because I'm not gonna stop." I did that right away. I covered my face in my blankets, and right away she began laughing again. I laid there for what felt like hours under my blankets, scared to death. Finally I awoke. Daylight. Now after this happened, I told my mum, and she called my grandpa, who was a pastor. He came over, blessed the house, and everything was okay for the most part. One thing happened after a while when I was a teenager, and after I got older I moved downstairs and got my own bedroom, and my sister stayed upstairs. Every night without a doubt, I would always wake up at 4:30 a.m. I would hear creaking down my stairs, footsteps, and I would hear these footsteps all the way to my door to my room. Then my door would slowly open. No one would ever be there, and after a minute or two it would slowly close. After my entire childhood of living there, we finally moved. I was 17 and had not noticed anything creepy besides the door in years. One night, my mum's sister and I were all on her bed watching TV. It was June, and that day we had horrible thunderstorms. The storms got so bad that the power went out, and we all decided to go to sleep because it was getting late anyway. Then all three of us wake up at the exact same time. It's still dark, and it's very cold considering the fact that it was summer and the AC was off. Then all three of us gasp as we see at least a 7-foot-tall figure right in the bedroom doorway. Suddenly, I hear that laugh that I'd heard so many years ago. I knew who it was. Then the creature whispers something to us, something that is burnt into my memory. "I found you." My entire body was in shock. He found us, the black man. Then he vanished, like he was never there. Nothing happened after that for years. That is until I moved to Florida with my then boyfriend, now husband. My husband worked third shift, so I always found myself not being able to sleep at night. I went out one night around 1 a.m. to smoke a joint. I have a very small house with a small front yard. I was planning on smoking fast and running inside. As I finished my joint and started walking, I noticed a long black arm with black claws stretching down from the roof, like something was going to grab my hair. It was inhuman. I told my husband, and he responded that he was worried about my health. That is, until he saw the black thing on top of the roof. That was the other day. Can anyone tell me why he's on my roof? I'm just wondering when he's going to try and come inside. My friend is Native American and was supposed to be the shaman for his tribe until he converted to Christianity. He said before he converted, things happened to him that he could not explain. When he was 4, he was a very mild-mannered kid who never spoke to anyone. He was held back in pre-K for being too antisocial. He was the type of kid who'd construct little highways for his Hot Wheels and make them wait at red lights instead of running around and making them fly and explode. He always kept to himself, and his parents never tried to force him to socialize. One day, his great-grandmother came to visit. He's never met her before. He was in the backyard playing, and heard the door open and close. He walked into the house, walked straight up to his great-grandmother, placed his hand on her knee, and with great compassion he said, "Don't worry. It's going to be okay." She passed away that night. Freaked his parents out so badly. When he was a little older, he would go next door to play and would hang out with the kid and his family, eat dinner there and play fun games. It was his first real friend. They played together for years. The parents thought it was cute he had an imaginary friend. My friend was upset. "He's not imaginary. I've been to his house, I've met his family, I've seen the inside and I've eaten his food. He's as real as you and I. I can see him, touch to him, talk to him, and he talks back." They moved away maybe a year after the conversation. When my friend turned 15, someone mentioned his imaginary friend, and he got angry again. He looked up newspaper articles to prove their existence, and found an article about a house next door to him that burnt down 14 years prior to them moving in. It was a family of 3 that was stuck inside. Their photos were printed. It was them. He cried. He says since he converted, these things don't happen often. His tribe is terribly pissed because he was incredibly gifted in this. He said he can still kind of sense when people die, but it's very weak. This period of my life started out as something very positive, but quickly spiraled into one of the darkest periods of my life, and the whole thing just feels like a blur in my memory. I started dating this girl that loved the show Paranormal. She had a pentagram tattoo on her, but she didn't even know what a pentagram was when I met her. It was essentially a symbol from the show that looked very similar to a pentagram. Things were great at first. I got a job at a warehouse working the night shift, and shortly after, I was able to get a cheap 3-bedroom in the city. I loved the apartment, and I loved her. Our relationship was great at first, so I get the rental agreement signed and we move in. I have 2 beagles, and I had just brought in their little dishes that they eat and drink out of, and I set them down on the kitchen table, and immediately the damn thing flies off the table before my very eyes. I didn't know what to make of it, so I just let it go. It freaked us out, but her more than me, because honestly I didn't really believe in ghosts until I lived here. I knew strange things could happen, but I just thought there must be some other explanation. The first major incident I can think of involved a brand new towel cabinet in the bathroom. I had just washed about 10 towels and put them in said cabinet. Now mind you, this cabinet smelled like fresh wood, and my towels smelled like fresh laundry. Well, the next day, that cabinet was saturated with the smell of death or rot. It freaked us out, but again, I wasn't jumping to conclusions, and anything could have been the cause of the smell. The smell was isolated to the cabinet. I seeped in my towels and re-washed them. The smell was gone the next day. Seems to me like an animal died in the wall, and the smell wouldn't go away. At this point, we had heard the place is haunted from the upstairs neighbor. Apparently, a 7-foot-tall shadow man in a hat had been seen. Neighbor's friend saw it and would not come down to the house due to fear anymore. Whatever this entity was, it seemed to have a sort of obsession with my dogs, and the dog's bowl in particular. So I'm at work, it's about 3 a.m, and I'm in receipt of a frantic phone call from my girlfriend. She didn't work and just stayed home all day and night, so she experienced most of this. She was in tears, and so scared she could barely get the words out. Honestly, it still makes me feel the same type of way, remembering how scared she sounded. She was in the living room, which was a big space, essentially half the apartment connected to the kitchen, which was essentially the other half, chilling with the dogs on the couch, when she heard a knock in the kitchen. My dog, Scout, perked up and starts growling and staring in the kitchen like there was an intruder. She's looking, and before her eyes, the dog dish in the kitchen very slowly starts sliding across the kitchen floor. She basically went into shock out of fear, but called me in, and I came home and did what I could, which was basically nothing, and put the dog bowl in its spot and went back to work. 10 minutes later, I got another call. The dish moved again. Her mother picked her up, and she spent the night away. The sun was up, and I got home, and the house always felt safer when the sun was up, so I just went to sleep. The front patio light started going on and off by itself. It was creepy, but again, nothing too crazy. My one dog seemed to never see the entity, but my other dog would always have this terrified expression on her face and would behave as if another person were in the house. The upstairs neighbor was going through the attic and found some weird-ass note in the prior tenant's belongings that said, "Madark is God." I gurgled Madark, and it turns out that it was some ancient Babylonian god. I bring up to the landlady that the place is haunted, and she confirms it. Cool, thanks for telling me that after I moved in. Shortly after, my ex starts hearing disembodied voices. A man whispering in her ear from directly behind her when she was in the bathroom. My voice calling to her when I'm asleep rooms away, and footsteps around the house. Tables flipping over in the living room in the middle of the night, causing me to storm out my bedroom ready to whoop some burglar to find nothing but an overturned table. Whatever this thing was, it was horribly negative. This wasn't just some haunting where a ghost is doing random things. It had a mind, and it seemed to be doing things that caused stress and negativity to take hold on my relationship. When things were good at home, the paranormal activity would rack it up, and then when things got bad for us, it would go dormant. It felt like it always had to keep everyone in the house at each other's throats. When I first moved in there, a moment didn't pass where it didn't feel like some unseen person was staring at me hard. I just always got that sensation, and it was unnerving. So then the nightmares and scratches started for me every single night. I would have horrible night terrors, violent dreams filled with people I loved dying and people in general being hurt. I would wake up with long red scratches all over my body and would constantly wake up pouring sweat and calling out because the dreams were so intense. I honestly can't remember the last time I had a nightmare before I moved into this place, and thankfully, now that I have moved out, the nightmares have stopped. Fast forward a little bit, and I have a meeting for work that I can't miss. I plan to leave an hour earlier just to be safe, except my keys had vanished. I look for them, and it starts to get closer to start shift and I'm panicking. I never lose my keys, and at this point, I'm ripping the place apart, ripped the cushions off the couch and can't find them. I left the place a bit of a mess and got the neighbor to drive me to work. She picked up the cushions, put them back and went to the bathroom, heard a bang, and went out to see my keys neatly placed in the center of the couch cushion, which she had just put back. It was unreal. This told me this thing was calculating, and at this point I knew it was actually trying to harm me. If I didn't make it to work, I would have lost my job, and it somehow chose this one day of all to do this. Unreal. Now I want to mention this because it fits the whole trend of the house attracting and fueling negative energy. The upstairs neighbor was this chick. Not a bad girl, but she had this deadbeat boyfriend that never worked and pretty much just laid around and did drugs 24/7 and mooched off her. Years ago, this guy had ended someone's life over the last hit of acid. It was ruled manslaughter and he served his time and was released. And a week after we moved in, my girlfriend caught him peeping through our window at her. Creep. So come to find out that my neighbor on his left, his family owned the house he was in, the house we were in, and the house to the right. Apparently all three of them were haunted. So to make a long story short, my relationship spiraled out of control. She left me, it had become toxic, and was for the best, and I don't blame her for anything. I have to accept that I messed things up, but that house added that last bit of stress on top of real life stress that pushed it all over the edge. I believe the entity fueled the flames when things were good, and would go dormant when things were bad. There really is a lot more to tell you about that place, but in all, it certainly wasn't a good place to live. I'm an atheist, raised in an agnostic household, and in no way consider myself especially sensitive to anything of a paranormal sort. I consider myself a skeptic, so there are experiences I share here, and only those I couldn't explain away on my own. Since my childhood home was a unique one, I'll share some details. Around 40 years ago, my parents purchased a Northern California ranch from a family who held the land since the original white settlers of the area. The home itself was a converted schoolhouse, moved and rebuilt board by board to its final resting place. It is constructed from crates collected from the San Francisco Bay. The boards still ramped with dates over 2 centuries ago. The walls are canvases with aged maps of the world, presumably from when the schoolhouse was active, plastered and painted over. Really quite fascinating and a little spooky. I'll start with what I call the man in the orange hat. This one's probably the easiest to explain away, since I was so young at the time, still crib-bound. I had my own small room in a corner of the house, which I shared with a doorless, long, narrow walk-in closet. The closet was always dark, the doorway looming to little me. I wasn't scared of the closet though, because I had a friend in there, a tall, grizzled old gentleman wearing a grey work shirt, matching slacks, and an orange feed cap. Every day after my midday nap, and before my mother came to take me from my crib, the man in the orange hat would come out from within my closet and we'd talk, sometimes for what felt like hours to little me. He always left before my mother came in, and eventually stopped coming altogether. My mum would hear me talking within my closed bedroom, and assumed I was chattering with myself as toddlers do. I would tell my parents what I remembered from each of my varied conversations with the man, which they wrote off as a vivid imagination and an imaginary friend. Today, I don't remember my conversations with the man in the orange hat, and my memory of his appearance has faded to the basics of his clothing, but his memory has stuck with me for 30 years. I'm not sure an imaginary friend would have left such a lasting impression. As a footnote, many years later, My parents recalled to me that the elder of the original homeowner's family had died in that very room. In fact, his passing was the deciding factor in the sale of the home and land. None of us have any idea what the elderly gentleman looked like, but grey clothes and an orange cap is a pretty tempting conclusion to draw. When I was little, my dad told me that our house used to be owned by what he thought was a cult. We know nothing about this supposed cult, except that the leader owned several nice cars that were remained parked out front most of the time. All of the windows were boarded up, and each of the bedrooms had at least 2 bunks in them. I'm not sure if this cult is real or not, and my dad could have just told me that to scare me, but nevertheless, that got me thinking the house might be haunted. This could be chalked up to my brain interpreting meaningless noise into something with meaning. But I was little, and would often hear my name called, even though I was the only one home or awake at the time, which I thought was evidence of a ghost. Fast forward to 2013. I was in 8th grade, and I wanted to test whether my house was haunted or not, so I used my homemade Ouija board to try and communicate with the other side. I asked if anything was there, and the shot glass that served as the triangle thing that types what the message says moved to yes. I asked their name, and it moved to R and stopped, and I was left with the impression that its name was Rebecca. I asked if they were in the cult, and it didn't move. I knew I asked some more simple questions, and I forgot what exactly they were, but I was left with the impression that I was generally friendly, and I moved the shot glass to goodbye. More recently, one of my dogs has become terrified of 2 doorways in the house. One is on the ground floor and one is in the basement. The ground floor doorway connects the living room and the dining room, and the basement doorway connects a room with a fireplace to another room in the basement, where we put the dogs when no one's home. It's worth noting that the fireplace room is the room where I conducted my Ouija board experiment. The first time I noticed him being scared of a doorway was in the basement. At first I thought he was scared of the room we put him in when we leave, because he doesn't like getting locked up for several hours while my parents and I are at work and school, and I didn't think anything odd was happening. But when he became afraid of the upstairs doorway, which he had no reason to be afraid of. What do you mean by scared? I foresee you asking. I mean tail tucked between his legs. He was so scared he wouldn't even pass through the doorway. If you call his name a shaken box of treats, which he would usually come dashing out for, he still wouldn't come. The first time I noticed this behavior upstairs, I picked him up and walked close to the doorway. It was my intention to make him cross it, realizing nothing was there, but he tried to bite me, so I set him down. People say dogs see things that we can't. Could there be a ghost that hangs around these 2 doorways? Maybe. I don't know. But I do know he's scared specifically of that doorway, not the door. He exhibits the same behavior on both sides of the ground floor doorway. As for the basement doorway, he could just be scared of the room itself, but I've never seen him be scared of the doorway from the room where he gets locked up. The times I have seen him scared of the basement doorway were at night, which wouldn't make sense if he was scared of getting locked away, as we don't lock him up at night. While I've yet to experience his fear of the upstairs doorway, I have experienced his fear of the basement doorway. When I was little, there used to be a TV in the dog room where I would play GameCube. I usually played at night, and when it was time to go to bed, I would sometimes be overcome with fear as I passed through the doorway. I would imagine a disembodied hand reaching out the darkness and trying to grab me as I dashed to the stairs. Did I ever see that hand, or do I believe that hand was really there? Of course not. It must be my imagination. But that doorway gave me the creeps when I was little. Even now, while I don't imagine a hand coming out of the abyss trying to pull me into the room, my animal brain sometimes takes control for a split second and screams "run" as I'm going upstairs before my adult brain chides myself for being such a child. I've also experienced sleep paralysis a number of times. As anyone who's had sleep paralysis will tell you, haunted house or not, sleep paralysis is one of the most terrifying experiences you'll ever have, even if it lasts less than 30 seconds. Two of these experiences stick out to me. I'll start with the first, less scary event. I had been having trouble getting to sleep the past few nights, so my brother gave me some sleep aid. I went to sleep almost immediately and slept for a few hours before walking and finding myself unable to move. This was my first episode of sleep paralysis, and simply not being able to move was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. After I got over the initial shock, I looked around my room and saw dark figures standing in my closet, watching me. This went on for a few seconds before I regained my ability to move and it vanished. I stayed up the rest of the night, as I didn't even know that sleep paralysis was a thing, or that hallucinations often accompanied it. Now, when I have sleep paralysis, I'm incredibly scared during the episode, but immediately afterwards, the fear is gone, and I usually can't even remember what I saw the next day. Just that I had sleep paralysis, and I either had a hallucination or I didn't. My second sleep paralysis story is unlike anything I've ever experienced before or since. I fell asleep and woke up in the middle of the night to find I couldn't move. This time, however, I heard something. Maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, but I never heard things in my sleep paralysis before or since. I heard what sounded like a baby giggling. Think of the cheesiest evil child giggling sound effect from a low-budget movie you've ever heard, and that's what I heard. And it only gets worse. Usually I sleep on my back, which just so happens to be the most optimal position for sleep paralysis. But that night, I was sleeping on my side, and I felt something breathing on my neck. Just like hearing things, I had never felt something during one of my episodes that wasn't actually there. On top of that, there was again a thing in my closet, but this time it came out, walked right up to me and crouched down, so we looked at each other in the eyes. Then I regained control of my body, and it disappeared. And that's all I have worth sharing. I've always been a skeptic of the paranormal, and though it's always interested me, have never believed in it, even though my own experiences could be easily debunked. The Ouija board stuff could be idiomotor response. Animals behave irrationally trying to understand why they do things, and it's often fruitless. And my sleep paralysis experience could just be my imagination. I'm not sure you'll believe this is evidence of the paranormal or not, but I've always wanted to share some of my experience of the strange. I hope you appreciated my story. About a month ago, I was sitting at the lunch table with my 6 close friends, like any other day at school. Something was off that day because my friend, Amanda, looked kind of nervous. It wasn't long before she told me she was going to tell me something later. I told her it's okay and she could tell me now, so she did. Back in late July, Amanda played the Ouija board with another friend of ours, and she was scared that I was going to be disappointed because we are Catholic. I told her it's okay and that she can do what she wants and that I won't ever judge her. Anyway, Amanda asked me if I remembered when she played the Ouija board. I said, "What about it?" And she said she didn't really tell me what the ghost told her. She told me that they met a ghost called Nick that died of obesity. Amanda said he wasn't evil. So basically what happened was Nick told Amanda and my other friend that Amanda was going to die before she was 20. Amanda told me that he also said she was going to die because she was going to be thrown into a river by a close friend. I started to panic, thinking this was me. I asked her who, and she said that our other friend called Becca. I looked beside me and saw Becca talking to our other friends and not paying any attention to us. I was scared. I asked if she was lying, and she says she swears that she's telling the truth, and that she will put her hand on the Bible and say she isn't lying. I asked if she or any of our other friends were moving the planchette, and she says no, as they promised not to move it before they played. I always told her not to mess around with ghosts or Ouija boards, and I feel scared. I would also like to add that the other friend that played confirmed the story. I just don't know what to think of it. I had missed the last bus home from a friend's house, so I walked home one night. It wasn't too far, and I was texting my boyfriend so that he knew I was safe. About 20 minutes into my walk, I heard what sounded like a chain-link fence being shaken rather hard. I turned around to see no one. Being late, I knew it could have been coming from a neighboring street, so I brushed it off and kept walking. Not even 5 minutes later, I felt something like small pebbles hitting me in the back. I turned around, and again there was no one there. A month later, I had gone home sick from work one night. It was around 10 p.m, and I was lying on my bed watching YouTube videos when I felt a cat jump up. Suddenly I remembered that both our cats had been let out. Seeing as we lived on a main street above a dairy that had a dog, we would wait for the dairy to close at 9 p.m. and the owners to leave before letting the cats out, simply so they didn't have to deal with heavy traffic, seeing as we had moved from a very quiet suburb. It meant they wouldn't get spooked and freeze in the middle of the road, especially seeing as we knew that the street was prone to traffic accidents. Sure enough, there was no cat on the bed, even though I could still feel one walking across the mattress. I later told my boyfriend, who shrugged it off. And later that night, I went to the bathroom on top of the cistern, and there was a small candelabra and the air freshener. Now, they had both sat on top of it for months at this stage without any issue. However, as I went to flush, I watched the air freshener bottle slide across the cistern and balance precariously with the majority of the bottle hanging over the end, and then go crashing to the ground. I replaced it, walked out of the bathroom, and stood in the hallway swearing to myself. My boyfriend had just gone to bed, so I let him have room to sleep. I sat at the computer, and after maybe an hour, my backpack, which had sat in the same place for a few weeks, again, without any problem, and which had not been touched for or since, fell over and spilled its contents across the floor. The odd thing about this is that it fell opposite to the angle that it should have been leaning. Around 3:30, my boyfriend went to the bathroom. I heard the distinct thud and then him swearing, as I had done previously. He came back into the bedroom, ashen face, and he said, "I believe you now." Next morning I was preparing to leave. I heard a loud exhale from over my shoulder. I was alone, and for once I didn't have music playing. That night I had finished work and done grocery shopping, and it wasn't until I was letting myself into the house that I realized I had forgotten to buy a light bulb for the hallway. As I went to go around the corner to the kitchen, I kicked something rather solid but soft. I quickly dumped the bags and flicked on the kitchen light to find out which cat I had kicked to apologize. And I saw no cat, but heard a meow from my bedroom. As I turned around, I see both cats come out of it. Now, before you jump to conclusions, after nearly a year of only going outside at night, the cats have become rather plump and lazy. If either of them had run away from me, I would have heard their little feet scamper down the hall. They came and rubbed against me, and then meowed to be let outside, which is obviously not behavior if you've just been stepped on. So I did that, put the groceries away, then went to tell my head tenant what had happened over the last 24 hours or so. I've been haunted before, and I knew that that was a lot of activity for something that had just started. Early hours of the next morning, I got up to use the loo, and when I went back to the bedroom, my boyfriend was freaking out. He said he thought I was still in bed as he could feel someone laying next to him. He also had very bad dreams that night, but couldn't remember them well enough in the morning to tell me. The next day, I was getting ready for work. We had a staircase from the front door to the actual livable part of the flat. I knew that the same flatmate was asleep, as she'd only been out late the night before. My boyfriend was at work, and we were the other two flatmates. I suddenly heard 3 sharp raps on the wall. I knew it came from the inside stairwell. The only problem was that for anyone to reach that part of the wall, they would either have to not be touching the floor somehow, or at least be 7 feet tall. This woke up the head tenant, who came to ask me what the hell I was doing, as the sound had awoken her. I told her where the sound had come from. She apologized, and then said that she was going to make some warding sigils for the house, since she was a practicing Wiccan. And no, it wasn't something that she had summoned during the ritual, as she hadn't done anything for about a month at that point. About a week later, I was playing with one of the cats in the hallway, when I heard something scrape across the bathroom floor. Even the cat seemed freaked out by the noise. He put his hackles up and started hissing and spitting and backing away from the room. I was the only person awake in the house at that point, and being late at night, the dairy downstairs had long since closed. Early the next morning, I was putting my boots on when something rather violently shook my chair. I was glad I was about to leave for work, and again, a gap of a few days, and I'm getting ready for work. I see a little orange and white paw poke out from under the chair. Thinking it was one of my boys asking for attention, I reach down to pat them, but there's nothing there. I look around the flat. One cat is asleep on the bed. The other I hear meowing from the hallway. The cats are fat, and as I've mentioned previously, could not move that fast. A few days later, it's 3:05 a.m. I go to the toilet, go to the kitchen and feed the cats, wash my hands, and as I'm going back to my room, the bathroom tap starts running. I was the only person to awake, and I hadn't been in the bathroom. It was quickly getting over 3 a.m. in that house at that point, and about a week later it's mid-afternoon, and I feel something clawing at the computer chair. Both of the cats are asleep in different parts of the bedroom. A few weeks managed to pass with no noticeable activity, but then one day I had decided to do some baking and clean the communal areas of the house. I had put the mop head on the floor in the laundry because I had been using the tub for something, and since people were asleep, I didn't want to knock it and make lots of noise. I was in the kitchen doing dishes and dancing around, when suddenly I hear a clanging noise from the laundry room. I went to see if the cats had knocked something over, and found the mop head in the sink. I still can't figure out how something gets from the floor to not the floor. 2 days later, I'm up late, as I have work the next day. I was watching videos and heard a noise in the background. I thought originally it was part of the video, but when the video ended, it could still be heard. It was the sound of running water at 4:15. I was the only person awake again, and no one had been up for over an hour. I could always hear people when they moved around the house, as all of the doors creaked. I went to the hallway and the sound got louder. I followed the noise. The cold tap in the bathroom was running as full as before. At this point, it hadn't been 2 months since the activity started. I'm terrified to leave my room between 3 and 4 a.m, and any time I do, my stomach ties itself in knots. I get clammy, start sweating and feel like I'm about to have a full-blown panic attack. I feel like I need to be physically ill and have trouble breathing properly. But the moment it hits 4 a.m, the feeling stops. By this stage I realize I had stopped seeing my guide. I have a black cat that I only ever see half of at a time, either the front, as it watches me around a corner, or the back, as it walks around one. I used to see it roughly once a week, but I haven't seen it for about a month at this point. A week or so later, I had planned to take my new camera to work with me, to test it out on my walk home. I would always walk home after a closing shift, as it was faster than waiting for the next bus. I had told one of the other girls my plan, except that I had managed to forget to pack said camera. She freaked out when I told her I walk home alone after 11 p.m, but I never had any problems. Seeing as I had left my uniform on for the walk, people left me alone on the rare occasion that I saw anyone. Not that I did anything overly exciting for a job, as I worked at a supermarket. So I get to the top of the hill, go to the lookout, and go to take photos on my phone of the lights on the other side of the harbour, just because I love the view. The first photo was fine. The second photo had a strange blue fog across it, and the final photo was also fine. I went into the gallery to check the photos, and the blue fog was a face right in front of my lens. Important detail: I was standing on a park bench and holding my phone above my head to where I could just see the screen, making this head roughly 7 feet off the ground. You best believe it when I got out of there really fast. But until I deleted the original copy off my phone, I was having massive issues. The battery drained within a day even if I wasn't using it. It took all night for it to charge, and it still wouldn't be full in morning. It kept randomly turning itself on and off, and the moment I deleted that picture, the issues ceased. About a month later, through strange noises and things moving in the house, this had become a nearly daily occurrence. I was at my friend's place this one time, and we were having a few drinks. Everyone else was around the table, but I had gotten up to refill my drink. I was roughly 2 meters away from everyone when I felt something tugging the back of my jersey. So now things were happening outside my house as well. A few months later, my wicker flatmate had tried warding runes, saging, and rituals to cleanse the house, as all flatmates are noticing strange things happening at this stage. I had gone to my sister's house for her daughter's first birthday, and I had spoken to her previously about what had been going on. But even though she is a very skilled medium, something was blocking her from seeing what was causing the issues. Thankfully, our uncle, who was even more skilled, was there. I told him about what had been going on and showed him the picture, as I had still access to it thanks to Messenger. At the same time, my sister was having issues in her place to do with our Nan's old man robe, and her elder daughter no longer wanting to sleep in her room at night because of something watching her from it. Our uncle had told her that it was just a curious relative, possibly someone who had given Nana the robe. But as soon as he saw the photo, his exact words to me were, "You need to get rid of it as quick as possible. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't want you to lose faith in yourself in being able to banish it. But you need to be stronger than you have ever been to do this." This scared me more than I had thought possible, because he didn't want to tell me what it was, or rather than who they were. But believe you me, between my flatmate and I, we had done everything we could to cleanse the house to rid ourselves of this thing. Finally, a month later, after plenty more activity in the house, hearing my name whispered in my ear at work, and hearing a child's laughter when I was alone, having electronics stop working on me, including tills and EFT POS machines at work, I somehow got rid of it. I moved house not long after. It was like a breath of fresh air. I wonder how long it would take for something else to attach itself to me. It seems now to be a running theme in my life. My wife and I bought a condo and moved into it a few months before she gave birth to our first child. I never got any bad feelings in the place for that time. After he was born, my wife insisted on co-sleeping with him. The baby sleeps in your bed. Once we started putting him in his crib, he was probably 8 months old at this point. He started having night terrors. He would wake up screaming. We assumed it was the transition to sleeping alone. There were times, however, when I would pick him up and he would continue to scream and would fight me to turn himself so he was facing the closet door. He would continue to scream and repeatedly point at the door, and he wouldn't calm down until I would carry him out the room. This happened every now and again for the next few months. It was creepy, but it was pretty infrequent. Eventually, it freaked my wife out enough, and she felt the need to nail up this old cross she had inside the closet. Once he was old enough to sleep in the toddler bed, it pretty much stopped. Or, if he woke up, he would just get up and come to us. Fast forward, he's now 4. My son doesn't ever make things up. He's never had an imaginary friend, and if he tells me a story about something, it's always a slightly skewed version of real events. Christmas morning, we're getting ready to go to Grandma's house, and I'm getting him dressed, and he starts telling me a story about his new friend. I have a new friend. Oh, what's their name? I don't know. I'll just call him Max. Okay, so what do you guys do? We were just sleeping in the bed, but then there was this loud noise. Someone wanted to get into the bedroom really bad because the door was locked and they kept crashing into it really hard. Wow, so your friend Max was in the bedroom last night? Yep, we stayed really close when that person was trying to crash through the door and kept our eyes shut real tight. But then Max got really brave and took me to the door to unlock it and let me get to my mummy. Now, that night the bedroom door was shut all the way, which is not normal, but it was cold and only in that room, so we put the heater on, and we never locked doors aside from our front door. That story and how unconcerned he was with the events he described was what really freaked us out. After he told me that, a bunch of memories of things he said in the past came to me. Mostly he would tell me about a guy without a face and fire on his head. But at the time I wrote it off to being the life-size anatomy poster my wife hung in the bedroom. Now, my wife is so freaked out by this, she wants me to burn sage in the house. Kinda hard to find whole sage in Chicago in January. Any possible suggestions for cleansing would be most welcome. I live in Adelaide, South Australia. I moved to the city from a small country town with my partner, Mrs. Brajikarp, roughly 10 years ago now. We moved into a small 2-story townhouse with another friend. It was a really nice place, clearly an older building, but the interior had been modernized. Everything started off okay. Our friend took the master bedroom, which came with a walk-in wardrobe, while we took the room next door. Both bedrooms and a bathroom were up on the 2nd floor. Under the stairs was a small broom cupboard. We didn't use it much at first because for some reason it was extremely cold in there. Nothing could heat it up, not even a heater. We assumed there must be a hole leading to the outside somewhere and left it at that. It was about a month into living there when the first weird thing happened. I was home alone sitting downstairs with the TV on quietly while I read a book, and I heard my name. I looked at the TV thinking that someone on there must also be named what my name is. But no, nobody on that episode of Scrubs was called that. Out of sheer curiosity, I turned the TV off and listened intently. Nothing. So I figured it must have been my imagination. And then I went to turn the TV back on. As I pressed the power button, I heard my name again. The voice was definitely coming from upstairs. I believed since I was a kid, due to other experiences. But this really got my hairs on end. I called Mrs. B and asked when she would be home. Not until tomorrow. I'm staying at my mum's tonight. Our other housemate was also away. I turned the TV back on, raised the volume and found some blankets in the cold cupboard, and slept downstairs that night. The name-calling continued on and off for a few months, but our other housemate never heard it. In fact, she didn't believe in anything paranormal and thought I was making it up. Mrs. B did, and agreed there was something else in that house. Not long after, our housemate moved out, and we took over the master bedroom. A few days later, a handyman came to install a TV antenna plug on the wall downstairs. To get the wires through the wall, he had to get into the crawl space upstairs. It was around lunchtime, and we had an awesome takeaway place just round the corner. I let the guy know I was ducking out for 10 minutes or so to grab food, and left him in the crawl space. When I got back, I found him downstairs confused. "Did you come back 5 minutes ago and call my name?" he asked. No, I said. And he explained that he heard the door open and close, and then his name was called. He chalked it up to my next-door neighbor, but I knew that wasn't it. The real terror began about a week after that. I came home from work at about 8 p.m. when Mrs. B was working late and couldn't be home until midnight. But when I walked into the back door, I distinctly heard her call my name from upstairs. I called back that I didn't think she'd be home yet, and made my way up. Opening the bedroom door, I instantly realized that it was not Mrs. B who called me. A wave of hate burst from that room and hit me like a ton of bricks. Never before and never again have I felt a presence like that. Whatever the hell it was, it didn't like me at all. I quickly got changed and took a look around the room. The walk-in wardrobe had a white curtain for a door, and I closed it every morning when I left the house. It was wide open now. I raced back downstairs, left the house, and went to the pub. I met Mrs. B at home when she finished, and told her what happened. She didn't believe me at first, but when she saw how terrified I was of our room, she realized I wasn't lying. The hate in the room was gone, but I could still feel something. We went to bed, and I closed the curtain, and I swear I could feel eyes on me. I slept on the side of the bed furthest away from it, and in the morning the curtain was open. We lived in that house for a few more months, and I never experienced this hate in that same sensation again, until our final day in the house. But there was still something there, something that didn't want me. I put all my clothes in the spare room, so I wouldn't have to go into the walk-in wardrobe, because that's where, whatever it was, felt strongest to me. It was also the location of the crawl space hatch. Friends have heard the voices calling out sometimes, but no one else felt the presence like I did. The day we moved out, I was the last one there. As I was checking over all the rooms and locks for the last time, I heard my name. I shivered but ignored it this time and kept doing what I had to do. I checked the last lock and walked out of the house for the last time. I got into my car, looked up at the master bedroom window, and I swear without a doubt, there was a woman up there glaring at me. That feeling of pure hatred hit me for the last time, and I floored it out of that street and never looked back. Mrs. B to this day doesn't believe me about that because she didn't see it. I can appreciate the need of seeing to believe, but I know what I saw, and I hope I never see it again. My little brothers both had the same imaginary friend, 10 years apart. When my brother Dominic was 5 or 6, he would spend hours in his room talking to 2 imaginary friends named Alma and Waka. He pronounced it Wakea. He spoke to them most days for about 6 months. One day, my mum found him in his room crying, She asked what was wrong. He said, "Alma and Wakea don't want to play with me anymore. They went up there," pointing to the attic in his room. About 10 years later, my youngest brother Charlie, who has autism, came downstairs from bed around midnight. He was crying but not making any noise. He came and just sat on the sofa, and my mum asked him what was wrong. "Wakea's dead. He's got blood in his head." He didn't know anything about Dominic's imaginary friends. We never spoke about it. With him having autism, he never lies, which makes it that bit creepier. We've had more experiences in our house, which was owned by a priest before us. I've been searching all day for what the names could mean. Alma is a Spanish word meaning soul, and waker means he who wakes. If anyone knows anything about this, it would be greatly appreciated. I've also been talking to my brother, and he made a really good point. My mum went through a phase of playing with a homemade Ouija board. I thought it was just nonsense, but to be honest, everyone in our house is spiraling down. My mum drinks a lot, I do too, my mother is depressed, and so is my dad. Perhaps it's all connected. I'm a believer in the paranormal, but keep my mind open to the science of it. Who knows what it could be? I grew up in a haunted house. It was a pretty old house. It still had horsehair insulation, that velvet damask wallpaper, dirt floor basement, crystal doorknobs, cubby holes that you would crawl from one room to another, and a really nice clawfoot tub, along with an awesome wood stove. It was big enough that it had a front and back staircase. The front staircase was really ornate, but the back staircase was basically just plywood. Okay, now that you have a visual, on with my family's experiences. When I was very young, I became more aware of the noises and actions, and my parents would tell me it was all in my head. The older I got, the more I began to doubt that. Starting with the everyday and night experiences, like the footsteps up and down every night, mostly heard on the creaky back staircase. Low knocks on the walls, taps on the windows, items moved or crashed on the floor, and the scariest was gentle scratching noises under my bed and feeling someone sit on my bed. I began wrapping my blankets over my head and blocking my ears with my fingers. Around 10, it became more intense, doors opening and closing with enough force that it was definitely not a draft. The silverware drawer was completely pulled out and smashed to the floor when everyone was in the living room, feeling not so much a tug on my hair, but like someone was lifting up strands. At this point, my little brother of 6 and me at 10 had been sharing a bedroom. All the rooms were huge. My dad built me my very own room that was previously attic space, but on the same floor. It was huge, and was more like a living room with a bedroom around the corner. Every few days, I would be in bed, and hear my door creak open. Someone walk over to my bed and sit down. It was terrifying. I still used to go blankets over my head and fingers in my ears. The knocking on the walls started to become more louder and fast. The scratching under my bed seemed to be a bit more violent. My parents still dismissed our fears. When I was around 11 or 12, it became even more intense. I had to babysit my little brother almost every day during the week. This was back in the day when TVs had knobs to change the channel. We would be in the living room watching TV, and the knobs would visually turn by themselves. Sometimes only a few channels over, and other times fast through a bunch. Like my parents, I downplayed it to my little brother, and just took him outside to play pickle or kick the can with the neighborhood kids. They had already told me the rumors about the house and would hardly ever come over. The most notable experience was walking down the back stairs. A strand of my hair was tugged hard, and I heard distinct breathing in my ear. I grabbed my brother and went across the street and waited in the pouring rain for my parents to get home. Ironically, where we waited was an entrance to an old cemetery, but I don't believe it was related to the haunting. The older I got, the more aggressive it got. TV knobs still being turned, curtains moving, steps up the stairs turning into stomps. The weirdest to me was the phone cord. It was one of those extremely long cords. The whole family was in the kitchen, and it started spinning. Not like a regular spin, but diagonally, like a lasso, about 5 feet off the wall. My parents downplayed that too, but by then, it didn't matter. I started to become desensitized. Going into 5th grade, I acquired a new best friend. She would come over, and it turns out we were both really into the supernatural. Watcher in the Woods with Betty Davis was our favorite movie. I ended up telling her about the house, and we came up with a brilliant plan to buy one of those Hasbro Ouija boards, candles lit and everything. Never even thinking it would work, and I don't remember if I actually did get it to work. But one day while babysitting, I had my innocent little brother play with me. The board immediately worked. My brother was freaking out, but I kept on going. I don't exactly remember the exact questions, but some of the answers were, "Kill John, my little brother." My addiction with all things horror, movies and books and such, led me to believe I had to burn the board. I took it out to the side yard and tried to burn it, but it just scorched a little bit. My father asked why there was a huge pile of burnt leaves and sticks, and I told him why, and he got really serious. He dug the board out of the sticks and leaves and tried to burn it himself on the wood stove. It still just scorched, but more charcoal-like, so he threw it in the trash. After that, things didn't get much worse, but different. I had a huge double closet filled with metal hangers. The sound of them clanking against each other, like a hand sweeping over them, became a new scare. I reverted to my usual finger in ears and blanket over head technique. But then I started getting pissed. I was so sick of being scared, I started yelling at whatever it was to leave us alone whenever it happened, and yelled that I wasn't afraid anymore, telling it to piss off. I had a game most people won't remember called Boggle. It was a cube of letters, and you shook it up and tried to find as many words as possible. One day I sat it in my living room and arranged the letters to say "go away" before bed. I woke up to the words being scrambled to say hump. Gross, I know. Everything ramped up. Louder knocks, heavier sitting on my bed, and more frequent visits into my room. By then I didn't care. I knew it sounds weird, but I started calling it out before I went to bed, and to wake me up at certain times, and it actually did with more gentle knocks by my bed. When something visual happened, I would tell it to cut it out. It didn't really listen that much, but it did occasionally. At the end of that experience, by the time I started fighting back, we moved. A few years later, my parents admitted it was haunted, and described some of their experiences too. I'm still drawn to that house, and I'm dying to walk through it again to see if it remembers me. Weird, I know. I've researched the house and owners and events related to it. The rumor was there was an older woman that died there and had an Irish wake. It was held in the house and lasted a week. I've desperately searched for the previous owners' names, but found nothing. One notable thing is that the house has changed hands quite a few times since then. A few months ago I brought it up to my mum, and she told me the previous owners were a woman and her son that was a well-known judge. Their last name was Moriarty. Also, she told me how the day after the house was sold, the woman's daughter ripped the kitchen phone off the wall and screamed at my mother, but now we couldn't use it to make long-distance calls. It didn't take long to find info on the son. He was a really well-known judge. The most messed up thing I learned from his obituary. He took a sabbatical to travel the world to visit sites that people have claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary. Why that is important, out of everything that happened. See, the image of the classic depiction of the Virgin Mary in my little brother's bedroom window was the most predominant memory. I wasn't scared but more curious, and then it faded. What are the chances? I'm also agnostic, but for some reason have always felt a deep representation when I need someone to guide me, so I recite Hail Mary. It's been quite therapeutic sharing this. There are many more silly stories about what happened when I was young, but at the present time, I've been seeing moving shadows out of the corner of my eyes every once in a while, as well as orbs. Perhaps one day, I'll be able to revisit my old place and see if the spooks are still about. This story takes place in the year 1993. I was a sophomore in high school. I must emphasize the importance of the year, as cell phones, internet, and effortless forms of mass communication at your fingertips were non-existent. There is ample amount of backstory. At this time in my life, my friends and I were very carelessly using a Ouija board that I found in my deceased great-uncle's attic after he passed. Again, I won't go into details here, other than it was a wooden board, old, and had no instructions. We took it home, and my sisters and I, along with my friend, began to play with it. Weeks went by, a few months went by, and lots of weird stuff was happening in the house with my friends. I am a strong believer in the paranormal, and didn't question much of what was happening, as it was witnessed not by just me but many others. I saw such occurrences change the belief of staunch skeptics in a matter of moments. I was terrified most of the time, sleeping with my lights on, and never alone. At times I was even amused by it. Then came a day in early spring of 1993 that my friends and I were sitting at around a table in the library of our high school. The topic always seemed to circle back around to what was happening at my house. There were 4 of us sitting at the table. Myself, Monica, Kim, and Suzanne. I was beginning to get a little agitated and began to feel arrogant. So arrogant that I said aloud to my friends almost these exact words: "If you're so powerful and so real, then you wouldn't be stuck at my house. So show us a sign you can hear us from beyond the board." And just like that, all the lights off in the entire library went out for an entire 5 seconds. When they came back, I continued my overconfident banter by laughing and saying, "Really, that's all you have?" The bell rang shortly after, and it was time to go home. I didn't think too much of the incident after, but I knew my fake, egotistical act may have some consequences down the line. That night when I fell asleep, I had a dream. This was one of those dreams or visions, if you may, that you wake from and feel it. You can recite every line and detail of it. To this day, I can still feel the resonation and remember it. The dream starts off in the morning, as I began to walk to school from the street. I am then plagued with a sense of terror and a sense that I was slowly being chased. There was a procession of black hooded figures, fully cloaked, with no signs of human life underneath, just a human form. There were 6 of them, all with their heads down. It was broad daylight, and they were each carrying a torch. In the middle of them was a very tall figure, again all in black with a red stripe down the front of his cloak. He was not carrying a torch, but rather a long pewter staff. This is when I stopped studying the details of who this was. I knew who it was, and I knew they were after me, especially him. They were not running or in any type of haste. The procession was slow and methodical. I ran in the school fast and frantically began to look for a spot to hide in the library, as that was where my dreams put me. I jumped over these bookshelves which were low to the ground, both in the dream world and real world, and balled up on a shelf, hiding and praying not to be found. That's when I awoke, breathless. I said a few words as I got ready for school and on the bus that morning. None of my friends involved in the library situation or the Ouija stuff in general were on the same bus route, and I dared not speak a word of it to the kids I rode the bus with, as most of them I despised. When I arrived at school, finding my friends Monica and Kim waiting for me at the north entrance as they did every morning, and I began to detail my dream to them. We had entered the main hallway as I finished recounting the dream, when running from the south entrance, which was a pretty good distance from us, was Suzanne. I do not feel I need to drive home the point that there were no cell phones and no conceivable ways of Suzanne getting any of this information. This is exactly as it happened and is 100% accurate. Trying as hard as she could to catch her breath, she looked at me and said, "I have a message for you. Him. Tell Nicole she can run, but she can't hide." To this day, every time I tell this story, I envision him laughing still and saying, "I found you." I was born in 1984 and lived in the same house until the age of 18. My parents had lived there beforehand with my sister, who was 18 months older than me. My mum would always complain to my dad about cold spots in the house and the feeling of being watched. He just used to pass this off as her being alone and spooking herself whilst he was working. My uncle, who was in the army, came to live with them for some time before either my sister and I were born. He was younger and used to go on nights out. My mum and dad used to hear children playing out on the streets regularly in the early hours, which they thought was strange, but couldn't see anyone when they looked out. The occasion that convinced my dad about the house was when one night they were in bed and my uncle was out. They woke up to tapping on their bedroom door. They thought it was my uncle, so said to come in, but he didn't, and the tapping got louder, to the point my dad got out of the bed and with a bat went to the door to open it. To nothing. This was all before my sister and my experiences started, and similar things kept happening. After we were born, they didn't stop. Another family member was sleeping in my sister's room on a pull-out bed, and woke to my sister sitting upright in bed, talking with no one. When she asked who she was talking to, she said the little girl that was sat on the end of the bed. Needless to say, that family member was spooked. I myself had had a few things, like bangs, footsteps, and 2 incidences stick out in my mind. One morning, I was sat at the dining table eating breakfast with my mum, and we heard my sister walk out of her room and start to come down the stairs. We could see the lower stairs from where we were sat, and they had a distinct sound, as stairs do. My mum said, "Here she comes," and we watched the stairs as each step was being walked on, but no one was there. We went upstairs wondering what it was, just to find my sister asleep in bed. This next story is more unbelievable. To this day, I've questioned my mum and sister as to if we actually saw this. My sister was 18. I was 17 at the time. My sister had gotten pregnant young, so we had her baby in the house now too. The baby was asleep in the cot upstairs in my sister's room, and was too young to roll/crawl/climb, like a few weeks old. We were sat at a dining table talking when we all heard and felt a massive bang. We all panicked and sprinted up the stairs and entered the room to find a washing maiden had fallen out into the cot, and my niece was fast asleep in the floor under where the maiden was resting in her cot. We were so puzzled, and none of us knew how that happened. After these events, we told people, and we were one day approached by a local historian who was writing a book and wanted to share our experiences in it. He also found out that our street was on a site of an old orphanage. Needless to say, he wrote the book, and we're in it, along with other ghost sightings in the area. Fast forward a few years, my parents had moved, and I'm living on my own, working in a job, and a new girl starts. Australian. Her family had just moved to the area. We were talking one day, and she started talking about ghosts. She tells me she has 2 dogs that won't come into her bedroom as they whine and act scared, and tells me her house is haunted. I say, oh, my house was too, and then she tells me that her house had been written about and was in a ghost book. Turns out she had moved into my old house all the way from Australia, and her room was my old sister's room. I can't tell you how much of that is too perfect for a coincidence. All of this is true and quite creepy. I'm 23, and I'm a descendant of the Whaley House in San Diego, California, and my entire family, to my knowledge, has had multiple encounters with a being that either followed our family one person at a time, or each of us is just more in tune with the supernatural, and we've all gotten our own personal hauntings. Now, growing up with my parents, things would disappear in the home and reappear in the least used rooms of the house, and would almost always appear to be hidden there. Sometimes objects would be exactly where they weren't 10 minutes later in plain sight. The same room you were in. There'd be noises in the attic room above on the 2nd floor, and there'd be random sounds, hearing my name called from somewhere in the house where no one was, peeking out of my room and asking if my parents had called me, and getting a no as a response was a normal daily thing. We all had our own interactions with this being in our home, and it was always a mild annoyance at most, with some slight fear, because obviously, what can you do about a stapler reappearing on your desk after you needed it 10 minutes ago and it wasn't there? What can you do when the remote ends up on the bed in the upstairs guest room where no one goes? My dad has a video of an I Love Lucy lunchbox walking forward on a shelf, teetering on the edges as if someone had gently pushed it, thinking that's enough to make it fall. It wasn't enough to fall, and so the being slammed it to the ground instead, in the middle of the day, while my dad was home sick, alone, and right in front of him. This story is to show that these beings don't care if we know they're there or not. He would also game in our kitchen or the PC that we had, and he played WoW until around midnight to 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes. He'd have our dog's toys thrown at him occasionally, with much more force than a dog could muster. Not really thrown, so much as tossed at him, I guess. I saw one such time coming into the kitchen grabbing a snack, and it really messed with us, but we joked it off. If it wanted to hurt us, it probably would have by now. Perhaps pushed someone down the stairs, dropped a toaster in the bath, whatever, but it never harmed us, not even scratches. This is the part of the story where I must describe to you the entity Jimmy. According to my grandparents, the Whaley side grandparents, they would hear me talking to a boy from the backyard without hearing the other boy's voice. They would look out the window and see me swinging on a swing, like I was being pushed by something more human than wind. They didn't interfere with it, because what can they do about it but scare their grandchild and ruin their imagination? And even past that, what can you do to combat a being you have no knowledge on that you can't see? My parents also heard conversations between Jimmy and I. They all sounded like normal, harmless conversations to myself, but I would answer back to a question that had been asked that I may not have been smart enough to think of by myself, answering questions of a higher caliber than any 4-year-old could muster. I don't remember any of the conversations, and as I've grown older, he interacted with me less and less. I honestly didn't even know about any of the interactions I'd had with an imaginary friend named Jimmy until my grandparents brought it up with me while I was visiting them, and they prefaced it by saying, "We think you're old enough to know now, but your imaginary childhood friend was real and he wasn't human. We would hear you talking to someone, full-on conversations, and we'd sometimes hear a voice that wasn't yours, but it never seemed outright dangerous or malicious." Stuff like that. It's important to note that none of these conversations were directly around other people. Everyone would at least be one room away, or a good bit off from me when Jimmy would come around. After hearing the information about Jimmy, I started to get bits and pieces of memories back together, kind of fragmented from a childhood view, which is how they're remembered. It's hard to make sense of, but I definitely felt like something was always there, and always has been. It's kind of reinforced that feeling hearing this from my grandparents. Now, I knew that I was haunted before receiving this information from my family, but hearing the name Jimmy in that kind of context brought me a feeling with the name, like familiarity, sort of curiosity. I knew he'd not hurt me though, probably. Now for my personal stories and encounters, both prior to and post hearing about Jimmy. I'd be playing World of Warcraft by myself at home while my family was out, and I'd turn around sometimes and see a tall, dark mass with red, smoke-filled eyes watching me from across the room, and he would always disappear the moment I noticed him. This didn't happen often, but I always got a chill in the back of my neck, the kind that crawls down your spine, that feeling when you get some unnatural stuff happening around you. I would see it outside of my home sometimes, like it was following me in particular. I'd be in school and feel a solid tug on my back to pull me backwards, and get the familiar chills, turn around only to find an empty hallway, then continue on my way to class. That was as far as things went for a while. There'd be noises throughout the house here and there where nobody was more so than I, just home alone. Sometimes with my parents or friends over. Living with it, you adjust to it, get tired of it, and it'll start to frustrate you. You'd yell at it to shut up because it's 3 a.m. on a school night and you need sleep, or were you trying to relax? Fear turns to exasperation. One night, the exasperation turned back to fear rather quickly though. I was falling asleep and heard a series of knocks in the house as I was quickly dozing off. All I remember from the dream I had that night is that I got out of bed, heard voices calling me to our game room from the deepest corner of the house, furthest away from where anyone could hear anything. I was drawn to the corner by some kind of force, and having no fear of the paranormal anymore, only anger and exasperation at the minor annoyance I'd been forced to live through all my life, I walked to it confidently. It was darker than the rest of the room by a lot, and the closer I got to the corner, the worse I felt. Dread overtook my body, and as I got pulled into the corner by a seeming horde of demons, I cried out for help. I had no voice to call with though, and the words caught in my throat, and no matter how much I forced them out, no sound came, not even gurgles or chokes, just silence. I don't know how long the dream lasted, being swallowed by darkness and demons, unable to scream, powerless and overcome by dread. But it stayed with me upon waking. That dream was 7 years ago, and I can still remember every detail of it. I still get that dream, that nightmare to this day, and I honestly don't have the words to describe the horror that these dreams bring me. feeling so powerless against something. I don't know if it was a dream or astral projection or whatever. I just wish it would stop. I've moved several times since then, and paranormal presences have followed me, or I've found them everywhere. I lived in Denton with the famous Goatman's Bridge and spent multiple nights out there, trying to find something and just enjoying being outside and alone. Being an only child and an outdoorsy person, I love being alone and outdoors. It's peaceful. Most nights out there I'd see nothing, but I always got that tingling feeling on the back of my neck that something was looking at me. When I would try to take people out with me, they would be all for it until we got a little ways in. Then they would get the same feeling I did and wanted to get out as quickly as possible. And I can't say I blamed them. It was always a stronger neck tingle with people over there. I don't know what was in the woods, but it followed my every move while I was out there, and I never once felt truly alone. But I settled for mostly alone because it left me alone, and I wanted to fish in peace. Some nights I would see a really tall, misshapen figure dart between trees or hide behind trees across the riverbank. Whatever. It just wanted to watch, I was sure. I even participated in some pagan rituals out there, and on the last one I participated in, a monarch butterfly flew over and landed on my finger. Then as soon as the fire was lit, it started to dart among the flames like it didn't want them there, like it was warning us to go. So my friend and I put the fire out, and no sooner had we done that, I felt arguably the largest neck tingle I'd ever felt. We got the hell out of those woods, and the butterfly followed us. It refused to leave us, and even got into the car with us. I dropped my friend off at her place, and she took the butterfly with her to care for it, and give it some food, and checking it for fire damage. So I drove home, and had my neck tingling the whole way. Everything seemed slightly off to me. The way my car was driving, the roads, the other drivers, even the walk to the apartment was weird. I don't really have a word for it, but it was like everything familiar to me was a little different somehow. I got inside, locked the doors, closed the windows as tight as I could, drew the blinds, and as I was lowering the blinds I saw a tall, dark figure with red, misty eyes looking up to my third-floor apartment from ground level across the way. The same kind of figure I'd seen while playing WoW in my room whilst growing up. There was another time my friends and I were going through a cemetery to get to their apartment faster. There were 4 of us in total, my friends and myself. We were scouting out the cemetery for the exit gate on the other side. We couldn't find one, so we walked back to where the entrance should have been and couldn't find it. I'm not saying it wasn't there, I'm just saying we couldn't locate it. We were in college and it was pretty late. We were a little drunk, but not completely out of it by any means. The point is, as far as I knew, we were just fenced in. This freaked us out, so we started walking towards the far fence to their apartment, and we were just going to hop it, when my first friend says, "Hey, do you think we could look into that building?" It was a mausoleum type building, and we told him we shouldn't, and we just wanted to get out of there. Well, he went to check it out anyway, and as he rounded the corner I got a great idea. I'd scare him by creeping around. I told my other friends my plan, and they hopped in on it. I crept around the same corner he did, made sure he rounded the other corner of the building, then crept up some more, peeked around and didn't see him, so I went around the corner again. Just then I heard movement behind me. I assumed it was him and laughed out loud. "Ha, you got me, man." As I turned, I saw him peek his head out around the corner and disappear again rather quickly. I then looked over at my friends around the corner. I was on the back of the building away from my friends about 10 yards away, and saw all 3 of them slowly walking off, knowing I'd catch up with them and laugh about my failed prank. But then who was that around the corner? I looked around the whole building and didn't see anyone, so I jogged over to my friends and told them that we really needed to get out of there. My friends know me, and I'm a pretty comedic guy. I joke around a lot. but they could see how serious I was, and we beelined it to the fence and hopped it as fast as we could. I told them what happened when we got inside, and Fremwad said the reason he noped away from the building so fast was because he got scared and he felt like he was being watched, and now was glad he did. I can only assume that it was Jimmy. That all of this might have been Jimmy. I have so many questions and so few answers. Is it really Jimmy? What is he? Why me? Why is he still here? Why did the butterfly cut off the ritual? It wasn't even a ritual for summon anything, it was just a ritual for the moon on the night of the supermoon. It wasn't necessarily supernaturally related. Why would he pick me and stay with me from childhood? Is he connected to my dreams? Am I connected to him? These questions just go deeper and deeper down into the night, and it keeps me awake. I've recently moved 6 hours again, and I'm living with my parents as of 3 weeks ago. The same things have started up. I went to bed watching an anime on my phone, and it died mid-show, so I put the charger in. I woke up in the morning, and my phone was on my dresser across the room, perfectly aligned with the dresser edges, and I hear banging again, and hear my name being called. What does Jimmy and the paranormal world as a whole want with me? Why can't they just leave me alone and let me live a normal life? Is this going to end badly for me? Moving forward from this, here we are years later, and I've realized I don't need to embellish any of this. It's all real and all terrifying. Everything I've shared with you is the 100% truth. Who knows if Jimmy is still out there and really haunting me, or if it's something else entirely. I'm currently 17 and live in Victoria, Australia. I'm a major believer in the paranormal. Let me explain my predicament. My family and I just moved into a rental house about 2 months ago and have been noticing a shadow out of the corner of our eyes. It started off in only one place where we'd see it pass by one window. This was interesting to me because several of my family members said they'd seen the same thing, and when we decided to finally talk to each other about it, we discovered that we'd seen similar things. At first, we shrugged it off. That was until I had my own personal experience. My older brother and I had been sitting at the dinner table. The table is right next to the kitchen bench for reference, when we saw a shadow of a head out of the corner of our eyes poke up, so it was just sticking over the bench. But of course, when we'd look over there, there'd be nothing. Now, we have 2 dogs that are in the house, and at first we thought it was one of them. That was until we realized one was in the room with my sisters, and the other was asleep at our feet. That freaked us out a little, but whatever. It wasn't giving off a bad vibe, so we continued with whatever we were doing. Before we decided to head off to bed, we actually saw it a few more times. My personal experience comes after, when we finally decided to go to bed, probably around midnight. I'd gone to the bathroom after putting the other dog in my room, as one dog is with my sisters and one is with me. Now, where the sink is situated in the bathroom is at the opposite end to the door, so you'd have your back to the door when you wash your hands. I'd finished washing my hands and turned around to locate a towel or something to dry them with, when I saw a shadowy figure walk past the doorframe. Me, being in a kind of curious daze, while keeping my head straight, walked very slowly to the doorframe which leads to a small doorway, and once I'd reached the opening, I could see out of the corner of my eye. It was so close that, if I'd have slightly lifted my hands, I would have touched it. But of course, once I looked directly at it, It's gone. After the encounter, I hadn't seen it in almost 2 weeks. I'm not sure if it's bad or not. But does anyone know what this could be? Because I'm a bit freaked out. I've never been into paranormal stuff because I've had enough activity happen to me over the years. Over this last summer, my friends and I decided it was a good idea to make our own Ouija board and play it at their house and also at the cemetery. They asked it stuff that I knew was true and they did not. Right there I could sense it was a real thing. Then out of curiosity, my friend Karen goes, "Will our friend Penny be pregnant at age 19? And it said yes. Fast forward a few months and I get a phone call from Penny saying she's actually pregnant. And in that moment I've never been so awestruck and freaked out at the same time. Nothing like that has ever worked, and now I'm a little more freaked out that I know the board worked. I cannot believe that it came true and that the board predicted something as insane like that. I kind of am excited about the other stuff we asked, but it was also very leery of it too. I'm nearly 30 now, and still remember this experience like it were yesterday. I was curious to know if it's happened to anyone else in their lifetime. I was around 7 years old. We had a huge 2-story house where most of the living rooms and such were upstairs. The garage and laundry were downstairs. The stairs themselves were quite tall. 2 flights of stairs went to the top, made some form of wood, and my bedroom was the first room on the right at the top of these stairs. I was sound asleep one night, when all of a sudden I was dreaming of someone being in the laundry. Immediately following that, in my sleep, I heard this extremely loud thumping sound. Someone was running up the stairs, and it was in a hurry. I awoke and I could hear it still. It was running, and then it stopped. A moment later I heard breathing outside my doorway. My door was open, as I usually like sleeping with the door open and hallway light on. I was pretty much frozen and petrified at this point. Usually, in bad dreams as a wee kid, you would call out for your parents. I was too frozen and too scared to do anything, let alone call out. I laid down and faced the wall, not wanting to move, and I could still hear that breathing. I had a gut feeling something was just sitting outside the doorway. I woke up next morning and noticed one of my figurine toys had been moved around. That was the last thing I remembered from that experience. I then started having awful reoccurring dreams in every house we moved to. These dreams lasted probably a good 5 to 7 years, and I would wake up in my dreams with my door open. I would look down the hallway from my bed and see someone sitting at the dining table. In my dream, I would do the same thing, just lay back down and pretend to be asleep. However, in the dream, this figure would always get up, walk into my room, and put its hands over my face. I would always go through a motion where I would try to force myself to wake up, rolling my eyes around and the like, even trying to twitch my body or yell. This strange figure, which I could never see since my eyes were closed in the dream, would try to suffocate me with its hands over my whole face to prevent me from waking up. Has anyone ever experienced anything like this? I was 16 and bored at my girlfriend's cousin's place. Thai people are a bunch of superstitious people. I'm only half, but my girlfriend, her cousin, and her friend are 100% Thai. We decide to make a Ouija board, just write letters and numbers on a piece of print paper. We decide to light candles and politely asked spirits to join us. Freaky how the coin we pushed around seemed to move so quickly and accurately, spelling out names of our future boyfriends and girlfriends. It was easy for me to blame Joey, the most excited of the bunch for manipulating the coin. We decided to put our Ouija to the test. My girlfriend volunteered to have the only finger on the coin, while the rest of us just touched her elbow. We also asked her to close her eyes and look up away from the board, and asked a couple of questions. After receiving no response, we asked our final question. "Is anyone here?" My girlfriend screamed and we jumped away to witness. We saw her crying as the coin spelled stop. Her eyes still closed, face towards the ceiling and tears running down her cheeks. It continued for 30 seconds and finally let her go. We tore the piece of paper up, flushed it down the toilet, and sat stunned and speechless. My girlfriend said she had absolutely no control of her body and wanted to look down and jump away from the board, but she couldn't. I will never forget that night, and I've been convinced of the unknown ever since. I was living in a house that was the model house before we bought it, so no one had lived in it prior to us. I was married to a man that I still feel today had a lot of dark energy around him. While in this marital home, one night I was doing laundry. The laundry room was right off the living room. The door was wide open, and the only light on was the laundry room light, which lit up the couches. I heard my husband say my name, so I looked up. There he was, sitting on the couch, but faced away from me. He had on a red baseball cap, which I thought was odd because I never see him wearing caps. I responded by saying, "Did you want to help me do the laundry?" There was silence, so I repeated myself, and I was met with silence again. Annoyed, I said, "Okay then, just ignore me, you weirdo." I suddenly felt this evil energy, so I grabbed the towels I folded and walked quickly to our bedroom towards the bathroom, and saw my husband in bed asleep. He was out completely. Besides, if that was him and he was playing a joke, there's no way he could have gotten past me, especially that fast. Weird things kept happening in our house. We had major electrical issues that would get fixed only to go bad again. Our air conditioning units both kept perishing. Then fixed, then perish again. Phones would never work. Our marriage was awful and my husband was very abusive. I felt this dark energy all the time. There was a door I would shut that would open the second I turned around. Nothing was wrong with it. Our master bath shower would come on full blast at 3 a.m. on random nights, and always the same time. One day, a frozen food delivery service was in our neighborhood. The man rings the doorbell and asks me if I want to buy anything from them. I politely decline and he says to me, "You know, if you ever need anyone to talk to about what's going on inside your home, you can always call my wife." Come again? I made no mention of this. I didn't know what to say and was shocked. "How do you know anything about my house?" I say. The chills came over me, every inch of my body, in front of my eyes, as if the sun rapidly set and the sky became dark. I was feeling this fight or flight, and I was starting to close the door a bit more. I looked at him, and the man's face changed into a distorted one. His ears looked pointy, and he looked so completely evil. I slammed the door, locked it, packed a bag, and as soon as he was gone I grabbed my kids and went to my parents' house for the week. This disturbed me so greatly that I haven't talked about it in years. I don't know what your beliefs are, but this changed my entire outlook on life as I knew it. I'm not crazy, I know this happened. I've had many things happen to me since, including a visit from a loved one, and I 1,000,000% believe there are different levels of energy in this world. When I was a small child, we lived with my grandparents for a short time. I slept in the back room which had a light fixture. This is relevant. The one in the room was bigger and didn't have a little extra on top. In this room I saw my imaginary friends, which I called my sparkle friends. I called them that because they were literally glowing/sparkling orbs of light. I saw them before I went to sleep every night, and they lived inside the light fixture. I didn't have to verbally speak with my sparkle friends. We spoke telepathically, and over time my sparkle friends began to change shape. The one I remember the most, and was like the leader, was shaped like a carousel pony with intricate detail. One day I decided to tell my parents. They shrugged it off. All little kids have imaginary friends. That night, my sparkle friends told me that I wasn't supposed to tell my parents about them. I, of course, ended up telling my parents the next day that my sparkle friends didn't want me to tell anyone about them. And that night, my mum brought a glass of milk to the room and put it on the nightstand. The next morning, my brother came to wake me up and saw the milk had been poured all over my head, and I was all nasty and sticky. My parents asked me what happened, and I told them, "I told you my sparkle friend said I wasn't supposed to tell you about them." I never saw my sparkle friends after that. My parents thought the whole thing was really weird and spoke to a psychologist friend about it. The psychologist said that because, as a small child, I was telling them the same story over and over without any changes in my story, the likelihood that I was making it up was slim. To this day it freaks me out. Those light fixtures creep me out too. Let me preface this by saying that I have lived in my house for 2 years now, and haven't had a single paranormal experience. No strange noises, no catching things out of the corner of my eye, absolutely nothing. My house is 124 years old, and I haven't felt so much as a single hair stand up when I walk around. This morning I was in my bathroom brushing my teeth, with the bathroom door wide open, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw there was a woman who appeared from the waist up only. She had turn-of-the-century clothing on, and she was wearing a bonnet with curly hair coming out of it. She wasn't exactly solid. She looked like she was shimmering, like how you see heat come off hot asphalt on a summer's day. I froze instantly. My mouth went completely dry, and I watched her float past my bathroom door into the guest bedroom. I don't know how long I held my position just staring into the hallway. I listened for some type of noise, but I didn't hear a thing. When the initial shock wore off, I went out into the hall and looked into my guest room, but there was nothing there. I know what I saw, and it caught me completely off guard, as I've never experienced anything like this before. I did believe in ghosts before all of this, but now I know without a doubt, it's a real phenomenon. I scared a bunch of people on night shift. I pre-recorded some murmuring and random words like, "Hello, you've made a big mistake," on my phone, then got a Bluetooth speaker and set it in a room. Why? Because we had planned to play the Ouija board. The place I used to work at was nice. The median age of employees was roughly 23, and it was about 30 of us all together. All of them were friends, but some of us were mischievous. Pranking each other was a daily routine, and often the CEO and COO were involved. They were always involved after the fact, when everyone laughed at the poor soul who got pranked on. One night someone suggested we play the Ouija board, and I couldn't pass the opportunity to mess with everyone. The Bluetooth speaker was a tiny one. The only problem was that it had a blue light which would be visible in a dark room, so I put tape over that and placed it inside an open box and had my cell phone connected. I was one of the biggest skeptics in the office, so if I could act scared it would be very convincing. I used an office iPad to record the event, and everyone was aware of the recording. We sat down and started holding hands, so I couldn't just take out my phone to play the audio. This is where my genius becomes tangible. I had set it up as 5 minutes of silence before audio started. And 5 minutes later the question on the table was, "Is someone here?" And amazingly, a voice came saying, "Hello?" Everyone freaked out. It was just perfect timing. Then the murmurs started, then a whispering voice said, "Don't mess with us," followed by numerous murmurs, and then, "Mark killed me. He killed me." I had to act freaked out. One slip and I would give it all away, and then a co-worker of mine let go of the hand and fell to the floor. He passed out. We turned on the lights and a few seconds later he came to. We gave him water and calmed him down. Seeing the collective scare on my co-workers and brilliant execution, I thought the best way to honor it would be not to tell them what I did. It's been a few years, and I'm sure there are 5 guys out there still telling people how they experienced a real ghost killed by someone called Mark. When I was 5 or 6, my mum and I lived in a small apartment. When we had lived in the apartment, I had an imaginary friend called Jack. Whenever I was home, I was almost always playing or doing something with Jack. I don't remember too much about playing with him, but I remember a specific time when my mum and I were leaving to go somewhere, and I told my mum to wait a second so that Jack would come. She said Jack has to stay home and can't come. I have no idea where we were going, and I was pretty upset about it. Later my mum learned, and later she told me, that only a few years before we moved in there was a fire in the building. Only one person perished though, a 5-year-old named Jack. My mum also told me that when she would bring her boyfriend over occasionally, he would see a kid looking at him from the hallway, only to run off into my room. He asked my mum if I was awake, and they checked on me, and I was fast asleep. About 4 years ago, my grandmother passed in her house. She passed of cancer, and it was a peaceful death. Then about 4 months after that, my step-grandfather also passed away. This one was a bit more brutal. He had gone into a big depression after my grandmother had gone, and stopped talking to the whole family except for one of my uncles, his son, and he was also the one who found him. My grandfather stopped taking all of his medications, which was terrible for him because he had hepatitis C, diabetes, and a few other disorders. He was found on the floor in the hallway and had been there for about 3 days. There was blood everywhere, and he was internally bleeding and he began to cough and throw up blood. After both of my grandparents were gone, my family took over the house. We renovated everything. We had to put new carpet in. The old carpet was torn out because my grandfather had hepatitis C and his blood went everywhere. When we first moved in, my mum and I liked to sleep in the living room on the couches because our rooms were being renovated. Also, the cable wasn't set up yet, and neither was the internet, and we could watch DVDs in the living room TV. We lived very far out in the woods, near the Bohemian Grove, so we had to wait to get satellite internet. My mum and I would usually sleep out there at different times because my mum works graveyard shifts at a vet hospital. However, every time we slept out on the couches, something strange would happen. Almost every night, at 2:43, give or take a few minutes, I would wake up terrified, covered in sweat and breathing heavily, on the brink of tears. I knew I had woken up from a nightmare every time, but I never remembered them. This happened probably 20 times before I decided I was no longer going to fall asleep in the living room. So I slept in my bedroom, but the only thing that stopped was the waking up at the same time every night. The nightmares never stopped. I was constantly haunted by these nightmares. I've always had nightmares, but they never happened as often as they did when I moved into this house. One night while my mum was off work, she had asked me if I wanted to watch a movie with her in the living room. It was pretty late, and I knew I would fall asleep if I did watch the movie, so I said no. When she asked why, I explained to her, and she kind of looked shocked. She said she had been experiencing the same thing, but during the day, and sometimes at night when she was off work. It was the same time during the day, and at night was 2:43 a.m. We were sort of relieved that we had both been experiencing this, but also sort of scared because we had no idea what was going on. One afternoon, while my mum was sleeping out in the living room, she felt someone punch her in the side. She woke up thinking it was my dad or my brother messing with her, and she lifted her head up and said, "What's your problem?" And no one was there. She walked all throughout the house, and not a single person was there. It couldn't have been one of our dogs. She felt a distinct human hand hitting her in the ribs. So basically, my mum decides to never sleep on the couch again. 3 years have passed since then, and we never did sleep on that couch during that period, and nothing really bothered us again, except for the nightmares that persisted. My boyfriend, who has been with me for over 5 years, even says that I've had more nightmares in this house than before we moved in. But about a month ago, my dad came home with a huge 4K TV. So of course, being the big movie buffs we are, my mum and I wanted to watch movies on there. Now, when I was watching movies out in the living room late at night, I usually stay up past 2:43 a.m. just in case, and nothing will happen. Except the other night, at exactly 2:43, I was awake and my mum had passed out. All of a sudden, I start to hear a whimper. At first, I thought it was one of my dogs wanting to go outside. But then I realized it was my mum. And when the whimper grew louder, into a full scream, I woke her up, and she was very confused and scared. I told her she was screaming, and she said that she just had a dream where she was laying down next to me on the couch, like she was just then, but I was asleep. She said she was unable to move, and was trying to scream because she felt I was in danger, but she couldn't get the words out. Then a shadowy hand grabbed my face, and that's when she woke. My mum and I are the only ones who experience the nightmare, and the specific times that the nightmares happen in the living room. Although when my older brother was crashing on our couch for a while, he claimed to have experienced some weird stuff too, like the feeling that someone was watching him sleep. We all have experienced things moving there on our own, like this antique kerosene lamp that we have on a shelf that just about touches the ceiling, flew off one day and shattered for no reason. It sucked getting the old kerosene smell out of the carpet. We've actually been losing forks as well. I don't know what that means, but they just go missing, and we're down to about 3 or 4 as opposed to the 10 we started off with. Our TV will turn off randomly at times without anyone touching the remote, and we used a warranty to get a new one, and the new TV does exactly the same thing. It's not a power issue where the TV just loses power or the plug isn't plugged in all the way. The TV screen says powering off and then shuts down. We do get random scents out of nowhere. My mum usually smells this old soap that smells like her grandmother, while I get a smell of something burning and it gives me a headache. My dad always smells something foul. These smells are unprompted. Usually only one person can smell it, and this has been slowly progressing over the course of the last 4 years. We're not really sure what's going on. I think it's my grandfather not happy that we're here. What do you guys think? My parents claimed that when I was younger, I had an imaginary friend. I didn't think that this was anything special, since plenty of kids supposedly had them, but I couldn't remember anything about having one, so I thought they were joking when they mentioned to me in passing. They looked at me very seriously when I told them I had no clue what they were going on about. Then they said, "Are you sure you don't remember anything?" I really had no clue. So they told me about my imaginary friend, Jin. My parents are superstitious, being Filipino and all. It runs in our culture. So when I'd started talking to empty spaces and asking to set an extra plate of food at the table at around the age of 2 or 3, my parents felt something was up. I was the only child at the time, so they brushed it off as having an imaginary friend, as some sort of coping mechanism for being lonely. But they still had their worries. He followed me around from my home in the Philippines all the way to the UK where we live now, which eased them a bit, having been used to hearing stories about ghosts inhabiting homes. So they were sure it was just my active imagination. It wasn't until I started calling him a ghost and complaining about only having a ghost to speak to that they really got worried. It was this that spurred them into thinking about having more kids sooner than later, and around a year after, I was told I was going to be a big sister. They thought this would cause my friend to leave, to no avail. If anything, things got weirder. My mother started experiencing strange things in our home. She used to hear running in the hallway. She'd have frequent nightmares. Photographs would fall off the walls at night, and only at night, and I started reporting weird things, like cutlery floating and my toys making sounds by themselves. One time, that really stood out to my mother, when she'd taken me with her for a handover in the hospital, to then pass me off to my dad who was finishing his shift. Supposedly, we'd been walking down a corridor when I'd stopped walking, and when I got to a set of stairs and pointed to the top, asking why there was a lady without a head. I was still very young at this point, so I was more curious than anything, but my mother was terrified, so she rushed to find my dad and ran us out the hospital as quickly as she could. After my sister was born, I spent less and less time with my imaginary friend. I was busy having started school at this age and a little sister to look after. I loved the responsibility and had fun pouring their formula and looking after them when my parents were cooking. So when my mother got pregnant again and my little brother was born, they had almost completely forgotten about my imaginary friend. Then I started to get ill. My attendance went down at primary school, and it got so bad that my parents were called in often to talk about the school and my illness. I was off for at least 3 to 4 weeks a year because of a recurring flu or infection. And then one day, a day I remember, my parents were downstairs cooking dinner, and I was upstairs looking after my siblings. One moment I'm playing Super Mario on my Game Boy, the next I hear multiple thuds all the way down the stairs before silence and a loud cry from downstairs. When I leave the room, I notice the baby gate at the stairs was open, and my sister was crying at the bottom. My parents rushed her to the hospital, and thankfully she only had a few bruises but was fine. They thought I forgot to close the gate, but when it happened again to my younger brother, they started to wonder if it really was my fault. It wasn't, by the way. After my sister's initial fall, I got so scared that I always made sure to check that gate, so when they asked me to look after them again, for a good while, I really did think it was my fault. But I remember checking those gates. I remember them being closed every time. So when my brother fell, I had no idea what to say to my parents except, sorry, which was probably a sign of guilt to them. Then one day out of the blue, I told them, Jin said he's going to go home now. When they asked me where Jin was going to or if there was a reason why, I only shrugged my shoulders. They kept asking me more questions, but all I could say was he was going home, that he wasn't going to stay here anymore. Things quietened down after that, and supposedly stopped altogether when we moved houses. I had no idea everything before these falls had occurred. I don't remember having an imaginary friend, I don't remember speaking to him, and I don't remember the hospital or any of the cutlery moving. So much of this was news to me, that I really thought my parents were making it up. But they will swear by each of these experiences. Even my grandparents had agreed when we were visiting the Philippines that even when I was young, this Jin was an invisible playmate that everyone knew of. Maybe I had a bad case of childhood amnesia, but it worries me. I supposedly did a lot of weird things without having any memory of it, but someone else seems to remember it like it were yesterday. Did anyone have an imaginary friend like this? I've asked all my friends, and no one even thought they were real until I told my story. Many who I told it to said I was just a creepy kid, and that he probably wasn't a normal imaginary friend, but I'm undecided, if not spooked, about what younger me apparently got up to. When I was little, about 7, whenever my dad was out of town for a business trip, I'd sleep in my parents' bed with my mum. This was one of those nights. Sometimes in the middle of the night, my mum would wake me up, saying that she heard someone in the house. It was only 2 of us and our dog. I listened, and I could hear a door slamming shut, opening and slamming shut again. The weird part was that it sounded like it was the same door over and over again. My mum called 911, while I silently cried in fear under the covers. I had never felt so much fear, and it was the first time in my life that I had been completely overwhelmed with panic. I also heard my dog going crazy out in the hallway. She was whimpering, and I could hear her collar jingle as she was running. I couldn't tell if she was running from something or chasing something. When the police arrived, the noises stopped. They searched the house, but found nothing. As soon as they left, me and my mum tried to go to sleep, but the door opening and closing started up again. My mum said she didn't want to call the police again, so I cried myself to sleep that night. When I woke up in the morning, it had stopped. There was nothing out of place, no open doors and no open windows. My mum doesn't like to talk about that night. For years after that day, I'd checked closets, under the beds, and anywhere someone might be hiding. Whenever I walked into a room, to this day I can't sleep somewhere if the door isn't locked. I'm 18, and now I can never forget that night. I've always been angry at my mum for waking me up to experience the whole thing when I could have slept through it and completely avoided the trauma. I also can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd have slept in my own room that night. Our house was fairly isolated. We had an attic that was never used, and the stairs to the attic were permanently ingrained into the closet. All that you had to do was open the closet door and go up the stairs. It was pretty convenient, to be honest. There wasn't a hatch, there was only the closet door. When I was a kid, I would have an imaginary friend. He would sometimes appear in the night, right before I'd go to sleep. We'd sometimes talk, and then he'd tell me to go to sleep. Sometimes he'd even lightly sing to me. It was quite nice. He was a tall, skinny-looking man. He had this gaunt face and these dark, dark eyes. I never found him to be scary, more just a company during the night. There'd be times where I'd call out to him and ask if he could sing me a song. He'd then come down the stairs, open the closet door, smile and sing me a song, before going back upstairs and vanishing into the dark of the attic. I just thought he was an imaginary friend. I never found him weird. One day, I'm talking with my parents and ask them if they know Billy. They ask me who I'm talking about, and I say, Billy, the imaginary friend of mine who lives in the attic. They give me a puzzled look and ask me what Jimmy looks like. I give him a description of Jimmy, and they just kind of brush it off, telling me that he's in my mind and not to think any more about it, but that they're glad that he comes and plays with me at night, singing me songs and such. I couldn't have been older than 4 at the time, so it's quite easy to understand my parents' instant dismissal of this. And this is where things get a little bit weird. A few weeks into having Jimmy be my imaginary friend, did my parents start asking if I was taking food. You see, we didn't have much money back then. We still don't. And when we'd wake up in the morning, sometimes food would be missing. Simple stuff like bread and cheese. There was one day in particular when my dad was preparing my lunchbox to take me to preschool. He opened up the fridge to pull the bread out, and in the little bag, there was only the butt, the end bit. He was sure the night before, after he made himself toast, that there was enough bread in here to make the sandwich. So she asked my mum if she had eaten this the night before. She said she hadn't, that they'd been together all night, which he concurred. So then he turned on me and asked me if I had eaten it. I said I hadn't. Things carried on getting weird. Leftover food would be nibbled at in the middle of the night, and my parents were starting to get seriously freaked out. Was this a hungry ghost? One night, as my imaginary friend was just about to go back up to the attic, I asked him, "Do you know who's eating all the food?" He said, "Sometimes I get hungry," and with a smile, walked back up the stairs. I didn't think anything of it. But the next morning, I said to my parents that I knew that it was my imaginary friend who was taking the food. Again, they gave me a confused look, but this time took it a bit more seriously. My father called his office and called in sick. I didn't know this though. He took me to preschool as arranged, came back home and waited in silence just to see if anything would happen. Nothing did. So he called the police. He wondered if there was someone in the house, and although he felt a bit stupid, as more likely than not there wasn't, he knew it wasn't worth taking the risk. So he called the police, and knowing that my imaginary friend lived in the attic, took them to my bedroom, opened the door, and together they started making their way up into the attic. The police turned on the light, and what they found there horrified them. Living in our attic was a homeless man. He had stolen my father's clothes, he had been eating our food, and although he hadn't done anything to harm us, he'd been living there without our knowledge or consent, and definitely wasn't imaginary. He was promptly arrested, and we never saw or heard from him again. I completely forgot about this, and just assumed that Jimmy had gone, as imaginary friends sometimes do. It wasn't until many years later that my parents told me the truth, and I was horrified to know that my imaginary friend wasn't so imaginary after all. When I was younger, I lived in this pretty old house in a neighborhood. It was always creaking as old houses tend to do. I've always felt uncomfortable and weird when I'm inside the house, even during the day, and tried to play outside as often as I could. I know I wasn't the only one who felt this weird, creepy vibe, because my mother once asked me to be there with her one night while she was cleaning the kitchen as she felt uncomfortable. This house gave off a lot of bad energy. My parents did not get along, which resulted in a lot of arguments, which must have caused some trauma for me. I was so full of anxiety that I barely spoke to my parents and stuck to myself. Overall, a lot of bad vibes and energy. But in a more of a paranormal stance, there were also times when the TV would turn itself on or off. At some point when my dad was walking down the hallway, I saw a subtle glowing figure following behind him. I even remember falling down my bunk bed twice, and on the second fall, when I got up, I realized my head was somehow under the bed, as if I was being pulled under it. But the main thing that stuck out from living in this house was that I constantly had nightmares, specifically ones that were always held in parts of my house. I had nightmares where there was something in my closet that was trying to come out, and once I woke up and noticed that my closet was slightly slid open. I had another dream where there was something coming out from under the bed, the shed that we had in the backyard that my dad built too. I knew there were 3 of them living there, since there were 3 lines that moved through the tall grass, and they were moving towards me. I'd always wake up in the middle of the night and swore that a shadow had moved across my window at some point. 11 years later, my family finally moved to another home, and stepping into that new house never felt so calming. No creepy feeling that something was home, and no nervousness when alone in the house. I could never imagine going back. But some years later, my mum had a friend that by some odd chance moved into that same house. My mum asked her if it ever felt weird inside the house, and even her friend agreed that she never felt comfortable while she was alone in there. I had an imaginary friend, Michael. I supposedly fought with him, played with him, and made my parents set a plate for him at the table and argued with people who couldn't see him. I don't really remember him or know when I stopped seeing him, but I was so adamant and supposedly things happened to freak family members out that they weren't sure he was imaginary. Being Catholic, I'm sure Michael brought up angelic thoughts in the family. My son, now 23, also had an imaginary friend named Gail. Where he came up with the name, I have no idea. Gail went through a progression. He lived in an apartment behind the chair in our living room. Then he got married, had a few kids, had a job, and I would ask my son what Gail was up to because I never saw him speak to him. Poor Gail, for being an imaginary friend, had the most boring life. I imagined he felt henpecked by his wife and his stressful job, and too many kids for that small apartment. I had my imaginary friend. I don't remember much about it, just what my family told me. She didn't have a name, and I just called her Friend. My family didn't think much of it, so they didn't ask. I basically did the typical play with her, talk and demand a place for her at the table thing. The strange thing that made them think something else could be going on was one night when my older sister and I were going to bed. We shared a bedroom, and he was asking me to turn the light off. I didn't want to, so I told her that she go, and we were back and forth until I say, "Friend, turn the light off," and the light went off. My sister, of course, ran to my parents' bedroom, scared shitless. I don't know if anything else like that happened again, because like I said, I don't have many memories about it, but it was creepy nonetheless.